You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
Hello, America, and welcome to Pivot Point, a show bringing you diverse views on the news. I'm your host, Maya Rockeymoore. Well, it's a wonderful day here in Washington, D.C. We here at We Act Radio in Southeast Washington, D.C. are actually planting a community garden as I speak. And everybody who's listened to this show knows how important I place on the issue of health and health care. And so the issue of fresh fruits and vegetables is something that's very important to communities, particularly communities that are without full-service supermarkets and have need and access to fresh fruits and vegetables. So I'm excited about that. Last week, I wrote an article called African Americans Chained by Obama's CPI Proposal. And this article got a lot of reads from, I originally posted it on globalpolicy.tv. That's the site that we run focused on policy issues. And I also cross-posted it on Huffington Post. There were over 1,000 reads, many likes. And so this issue of how Obama's 2014 budget actually impacts various communities, not just African Americans, but all Americans. And in fact, We Act Radio posted that article on their listserv, and one person wrote in and said, well, it affects everybody, but absolutely it affects everybody, and it's an awful proposal. However, it affects different populations differently because we're situated differently. Unfortunately, in this country, we still have different circumstances for different populations based on factors such as race, ethnicity, class, gender. And so in order to understand the full impact of policy proposals and policies on populations, you actually have to understand how these proposals actually impact different populations. And so, as you all well know, I write typically for broad audiences. I also write based on my gender status and through the lens of gender. I also write focused on class issues. I also write on race and ethnicity. And in this particular case, I wanted African Americans to understand how President Obama's chain CPI proposal would specifically hurt them. And most folks don't understand that there is a racial wealth gap in this country. For every $1 in wealth held by the typical white family, African Americans only have 5 cents of owned wealth assets. Do you hear me? For every $1 in wealth held by the typical white family, the typical African American family only holds 5 cents of wealth. That is called the racial wealth gap. And so how does the racial wealth gap connect to the chain CPI? Well, the fact of the matter is that these wealth differentials track people throughout life. And so when you're talking about retirement security, you actually have a situation where the wealth differentials also impact your ability to retire securely with resources. And so African Americans tend to have less resources over their lifetimes. And as a result, in retirement, they're more heavily dependent upon the Social Security benefits that they earn. Now, if they're more heavily dependent, and the specific statistic is that when they're more heavily dependent, and for every the statistic is that African Americans depend on Social Security. 47% of African American seniors rely on Social Security for 90% or more of their income upon retirement, compared to 33% of whites. So that means that cuts to Social Security in the form of less generous cost of living adjustments will have a disproportionate impact on African American seniors, compounded by the fact that they have lower life expectancies, which means that the exemption for the very old, which is not a true exemption because it still results in cuts for the very old, African Americans would be less likely to access those exemptions, and they would be more harmed over their retirement lives by those cuts that will make it harder for them to make ends meet, to go to the grocery store and be able to afford, the rising cost of bread, gas, rent, and certainly medical costs are out of the question. So we have, this question about, not only why do we seem to have a nation that allows inequality, but how is it that we have institutions that actually create inequality? And I'm going to actually get into that conversation with our top of the hour guests. But I want to just briefly acknowledge that later in the show, we will be joined by Dr. William Spriggs, who serves as the chief economist at the AFL-CIO. He is a professor in and the former chair of the Department of Economics at Howard University. And Bill actually assumed this role after actually serving in the Obama administration as a deputy assistant secretary in the U.S. Department of Labor. But first, I am very pleased to welcome to my show for the very first time Isaiah Poole. He has been the editor of ourfuture.org since 2007, and he also directs the Campaign for America's Futures on a campaign for America's Future online communications operation. He previously worked for 25 years in mainstream media, most recently at Congressional Quarterly, where he covered congressional leadership and tracked major bills through Congress. Welcome, Isaiah.
Thank you.
We're also joined by Dr. Margaret Flowers. She is the co-chair of the Maryland chapter of Physicians for a National Health Plan and serves on its national board. She is a Maryland pediatrician and serves on the board of Healthcare Now and on the steering committee of the Leadership Conference for Guaranteed Healthcare. Welcome, Dr. Flowers.
Thank you for inviting me, Maya.
Listen, I want to kind of backtrack to this question of, how is it that we keep having these various proposals that not only kind of do a wink and a nod to this issue of inequality in this country, meaning that our policies are not addressing inequality. And in fact, some policies are actually creating inequality. Isaiah, you have any specific?
I think what we have is a fundamental, when you look at our politics today, we have this dichotomy of America being founded based on a principle of rugged individualism, the idea that you are on your own, that you come to this country and you rise to the top based on your own, your own stuff, whatever you bring to the table.
Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps.
You pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. Missing from that, obviously, is the notion of America as a community. And Martin Luther King was very eloquent in talking about us, we as being interdependent, so that none of us can be fully successful if some of us are left behind. That was the core of his message, and that in order for us to be a full nation, living at our full potential, we have to worry about the people who aren't succeeding in getting themselves up by their own bootstraps. The people who have had their boots taken from them. They never got boots to begin with.
Right.
And so we're still living with the fact that we don't get it when it comes to really being an interconnected community. And that's why we have a political system right now that says to people who have been left behind, who are being marginalized economically, who are being marginalized health-wise. We're saying to these people, it's not our problem. That's what the political system says. And we have an entire political party that is built around that very notion that it's not our problem.
Dr. Flowers, you have been a veteran in the Washington wars, particularly around health care. Your advocacy on behalf of a single-payer national health care system almost saw some light of day during the debate around the nation's what eventually became known as the Affordable Care Act. What did that experience teach you about equality and inequality in this country, and the willingness or the lack of willingness of policymakers to really dig in and address this?
Thank you. I think to answer that it means that I need to build on what Isaiah said, because certainly the United States, people in the United States are one of the most propagandized around the world in terms of being led to believe that, we're not, that we don't have to care about other people, that if someone has something, it's taking away from what we have. But despite that, people do understand these connections. And, for solutions, real solutions, like a Medicare for all or single-payer system, we see solid supermajority support. For other solutions like preserving and strengthening Social Security or cutting our military funding, all of these things, we have supermajorities of Americans that already support them. But what we have is, I don't think that the political system is broken because of these beliefs. The political system is not addressing what the people want or even what we need. And it comes down to corporate power, corporations controlling the political process, controlling both of the dominant parties in Washington, D.C. The Democrats and the Republicans are both pursuing austerity policies because that's what Wall Street wants them to do. And there's no regard for human life, which is what I found as a congressional fellow for Physicians for a National Health Program in Congress, is that there was no interest in evidence or what people needed. It was what the corporations could do to write laws that helped their bottom line.
Dr. Flowers, you just said a lot, and my listeners here at Pivot Point have heard us ranting literally for the past several months about the nation's CEOs and how they have organized to actually cut Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid for the population. And many of these companies don't even offer health insurance benefits or retirement plans for their constituents. And so I'm always faced with the question about, what is their true motivation? I mean, how do they expect people to live? I just don't quite get what they are thinking. But Isaiah, I know that you have been very focused on this issue of, the whole notion of our nation's politics being co-opted by the wealthy. What's your hypothesis?
Well, there was once something of a social contract between business and labor that says, yes, business is here to make money, but we understand as businesses that the best way for us to make money is to be in an economy that is holistically healthy,
right,
with a thriving middle class, with people who are doing well, and people who are doing well will then have the means by which to buy our goods, and we will make money selling them stuff. And that's how you create a virtuous cycle that way. That virtuous cycle was broken starting as early as the 1970s. Certainly by the time Ronald Reagan came into office in 1980, it was pretty fractured. And the dominant thrust of much of the business community became short-term profit.
And what fractured it? What was the issue? Was there a defining issue, or you think this was something that eroded over time?
Well, I think I think there's something that eroded over time. There are certainly landmark events that happened. For example, in the early 70s, Lewis Powell, when he was a corporate lobbyist before he joined the Supreme Court, wrote something called the Powell Memorandum, which encouraged organizations like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to start flooding Washington with lobbyists and lobbying power to prevent the federal government from being too big and too controlling over business. But also the notion that the only reason that business exists is to make profit for shareholders come first, CEOs come first, and if you happen to do something good for your customers and the rest of the community, fine. But it's all about the what you can show in that quarterly Wall Street report has really had some devastating consequences, because a lot of the policies we actually need require long-term thinking and long-term restructuring of the economy. Let me just say one more thing. When when you also set up a situation where you can pit countries against each other and pit workforces against each other in a race to the bottom, that sets us up for a situation where American workers cannot win. When they're Chinese workers or Vietnamese workers or wherever.
You're talking about the cheapest labor, where you have
Exactly.
this international product chain kind of thing going on, where
Exactly.
the multinationals are seeking the nation that has the cheapest labor,
Right.
fewest fringe benefit costs, et cetera. And I used to joke around, and now it's not a joke, that the U.S. economy would bring back manufacturing jobs once American labor became cheap enough. Which meant that we would have a pretty stark breakdown in everything that we, are in our advances. But now manufacturing is starting to come back.
For exactly the reason you said.
Yeah. Dr. Flowers, this week the nation was transfixed by what happened in Boston. That we had another terrorist attack. I think that they're referring to it in the news media on U.S. soil. I think that we're still trying to understand the details of exactly what the motivation was for the bombings that took place over the weekend at the Boston Marathon. But I got to tell you that I was just struck dumb where when I read about the gentleman who had his legs blown off, Jeff Bauman is his name. He is a Costco worker who is doing what everyone is supposed to do in this nation. He is working hard. He is supporting himself. But it turns out that this bomb actually revealed that he does not have access to health insurance. And the fact of the matter is that his friends have created a fund called Bucks for Bauman, where they're looking for donations. They have raised quite a bit of money thus far, I think about $360,000. However, they estimate that the injured victims from the bombing, their medical costs are expected to exceed around $9 million. So I want you to put this in the context of what we've been talking about, equality and inequality, and how our nation's policies are actually fueling inequality. How can anybody expect that one day they're going to be standing, waiting for somebody to cross the finish line, and then all of a sudden their legs are blown off and they're going to need health insurance and they don't have it?
Right, which is exactly where I was 10 years ago that day when I ran the Boston Marathon, and my 3 children, ages 6 to 10, were waiting for me at the finish line. The United States is unique among all the industrialized nations in that we don't have a health system that's universal and guaranteed for every person. The majority of those health systems are publicly financed. They spend less per person each year than we do, in some cases twice, half of what we're spending, and they have better health outcomes. It's just in the United States, we use this uniquely market-based system of financing our health care through private insurance and these private corporations. And it's not unusual in the U.S. that people have to hold bake sales in order to get their health care needs met, to pay for them. Even people who have health insurance experience significant financial difficulty paying for the health care that they need. And we know that of people that go into bankruptcy, about 62% of them go into bankruptcy because of medical costs or medical illness, and about 80% of those people had some form of health insurance, so it didn't protect them. President Obama said that he wanted to stand with the victims of the bombing. The best way he could stand with them is by expanding Medicare to everyone immediately so that nobody had to worry about whether they could afford the health care.
You know what strikes me about the anecdote you just shared about the worker from Costco? It's great that he had the network that would step up to the plate and try to raise money for his health care because he had his leg blown off. But for many, many people, if you're talking about people in the African American community, the Latino community, elsewhere, who don't have those kinds of networks, who have equally devastating injuries and medical needs, and if they set a jar at the 7-Eleven, they're not going to get thousands of dollars in donations to help them. I mean, and I think the immorality of having a healthcare system in which you are dependent upon your ability to win sympathy from people. I mean, that is just a fundamentally immoral health system. It should embarrass us before the world.
if that happened in any other country, people wouldn't, have to worry about that. In fact, I learned today in researching an article that the father of the bombing suspects had to return to Russia because of health problems, to get his health needs met. And so he wasn't here with his sons. That's what happens when we have a health law that's written by the industries that profit off it, which is what happened with the Affordable Care Act.
Actually, I'm going to get into that. I'm going to get into that in a second, but I do want to probe this because I was listening to the news last night and the coverage of the bombing, and one newscaster said, well, why would his father go back to Russia to get health care when Boston has the best health care system and the best hospitals in the world? And I think what that showed me is in stark relief that we have haves and we have have-nots, and the haves simply do not understand what the have-nots are going through.
Well, we ration health care in the U.S. based on ability to pay. So people who are able to afford it can get the care they need, and we have excellent facilities. But for way too many people, they suffer and die of preventable causes just because they don't have the money to pay for them.
It's interesting. I was speaking in Chicago not too long ago, and I was speaking about the Affordable Care Act, and I spoke to the audience, and I talked about how, advances in our society have been tied, major pieces of legislation have been tied to getting rid of discrimination. And so, with the passage of Social Security in 1935, we decided that we no longer wanted to discriminate against the very old. With the passage of Medicare, we no longer wanted to ensure that health insurance companies couldn't discriminate against the very old. And then with the addition of Medicaid, we wanted to make sure that affordability could be there so that people could access care. Yet I did mention that we do still need to get to a point in our nation where we do not discriminate against people based on the ability to pay. And do you know that got no claps?
Well, in fact, I just got a call yesterday, a robocall from an organization that I wish I could remember the name of, but it presented itself as a Christian organization. And the message on this robocall was that Obamacare is coming and is going to levy all of these taxes on people, and we don't need these new taxes, and you should call your governor. Of course, in D.C. we don't have a governor, but the intent was to get names on a petition so that more governors could be persuaded to opt out of Obamacare.
Opt out of the Medicaid provision.
And opt out of the Medicaid provision. And it was stunning. Well, for one thing, it stunned me that they would make that call in the District of Columbia where there's overwhelming support for it. But more fundamentally, the idea, again, that we're saying that the argument is that we should not bear a burden for those of us who are ill.
So, Dr. Flowers.
And this is being moved. That message is being sold by a Christian organization.
Dr. Flowers mentioned earlier that the notion of our politics being bought and that policymakers on both sides of the aisle not caring about the life or death issues that are tied up into the issue of health care and the affordability of health care. Dr. Flowers, there is a lot of angst in the progressive community about how the negotiations around the Affordable Care Act went down. First of all, the fact that single-payer universal health care was actually put off the table from the very beginning. It was never considered as an option. But then the single-payer light kind of approach with the public option being also taken off the table. Can you tell us what your perspective was on the negotiations, what happened, and what we're left with now?
Oh, it's pretty clear that the final bill, the Affordable Care Act, was pretty much decided upon before, the president was even inaugurated. You had Liz Fowler, who worked for Senator Max Baucus, the head of the Finance Committee, which was a real committee that drove that process. She left her job at WellPoint to come and kind of spearhead that health reform process in Congress. And so while the public option was put out there and there was, a lot of efforts to try to make it look like it was a backdoor to single payer. At the same time, those of us who work in health policy were saying that it's not a backdoor to single payer. That was actually used to split the population of people that support health reform. Remember, even though you have these small organizations calling and trying to convince you to be against health reform, the majority of people in the United States support single payer. And if you had said maybe at that conference, what we really need is single payer, I'm sure you would have gotten a lot of claps, because that happens every time that it's mentioned. So the people were led to believe that the public option was a solution, even though in March of 2009, Senator Baucus said at the Center for American Progress that that was a bargaining chip. It was never meant to be in the final legislation. So we just saw this kind of political theater throughout that whole reform process that drove people to accept this piece of legislation, which further increases the privatization of our health care in this country. It takes us in the complete wrong direction from where we need to be going.
What does it say about our system? Because President Obama in 2008 ran on the public option as a key component of his health plan. And so what we see here is a situation where he was very willing to concede that ground early on in the process, perhaps.
Well, that's one way of looking at it, that he conceded, but I think that there was an intention from early on for that public option never to be in there. It was really just a way to divide the reform movement so that single-payer supporters were really caught up in some of them were convinced that they had to push for a public option because that's all they could get instead of pushing for the real thing. And I think the reason that the progressives are in such a bad situation is that there's too much allegiance to political parties instead of allegiance to the issues. In the end, the Affordable Care Act all came down to being about whether Obama would be reelected or not, instead of whether it was about what the nation needed. And it's driven us in a direction where we're going to see more inequality instead of less. We're going to see higher premiums. I think that the numbers that have been estimated to be covered by this legislation are grossly overestimated. We're going to see a lot. We're going to see tens of millions of people still without access to health insurance, even when the bill's fully implemented.
As one of the people who was actually fighting for and advocating for the public option, I mean, I think in retrospect, you can lay out the scenarios as she laid it out. But I think there were some of us who really did authentically think that given what the political realities were at the moment, that if we succeeded in getting a public option, that was a platform on which to build towards single payer. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think there were some of us who actually legitimately believed that, and it wasn't necessarily a party thing, but it was the notion of, do you throw the Hail Mary pass and lose, or do you go for a 50-yard pass and then have another down to complete the touchdown?
All right.
Well, I think that just doesn't make any sense if you look at the evidence, because public options have been tried in the United States before, and there's clear evidence to show that they fail, that, you can't build a system for the people that's going to be universal if you leave the private insurance as part of it. It has never worked in this country, and there's a lot of good reasons for why it's not going to work. So it's unfortunate. I do believe that people really thought that was a solution. Unfortunately, it was very based on not solid evidence, and as well as that, not a very good negotiating strategy, because 80% of Democrats support single payer, and you don't start from a position of compromise when you negotiate. You start from what you really need, and then if there's a need to compromise, then maybe you do that.
Actually, we're going to pick back up on that theme after the break, but Dr. Flowers, first I want to thank you for joining us and for sharing your insight this today on this very important issue. One quick question for you before I let you go is the issue of some of the progressive states and how they're structuring their health exchanges. Do you see any positives there?
I don't. The health exchanges just add more bureaucracy, as we've seen in Massachusetts, and more cost to the system. The health exchanges actually are tiered health plans where most people are going to be driven to purchase health plans that are grossly inadequate for their needs. And I just wanted to say before I go that, if people are really want to do something effective to stop the cuts to our Social Security, to stop the cuts to Medicare, it's going to really take action. It's not about signing letters or signing petitions. People really need to get into their congressional members' offices and stop them from being able to function until they agree to not make these cuts. Anything less than that, we're just going to, we're going to see this kind of march towards greater austerity and greater inequality.
Is there a website you want to give us?
Well, I have a number of websites. I guess the best one would be to go to our media one, clearingthefogradio.org, where we post regular articles that we write, and people can get information there.
Thank you, Dr. Flowers.
Clearingthefogradio.org. Thank you.
For our listening audience, please stay with us after the break, where we will be joined by Dr. Bill Spriggs, and we will keep Isaiah Poole talking about economy and the jobs. You are listening to Pivot Point with Maya Rockeymoore, sponsored by the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare.
This is John Bauman. You know me best as Bowser, formerly of the group Shot On Up. And you know, when we were rocking and rolling all those years ago, I wasn't particularly worrying about my retirement or how I'd pay for health care. But now that I'm 65, I really understand the importance of Medicare. Not just for myself, but for generations of working Americans who need secure health care as they get older. That's why this election is so important. The Romney-Ryan Coupon Care Plan will mean the end of traditional Medicare. It gives seniors a partial payment which loses value over time and raises our health care costs as much as $500 more each month. Coupon Care also puts us at the mercy of private insurers, making it harder to pick our own doctors. All of this to pay for tax cuts for the wealthy? Are you kidding me? Americans of all ages say no to Coupon Care. Bum 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 dang 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 ding a dong ding. Preserve Medicare.
This is Margaret Flowers.
And I'm Kevin Zeese. Join us every Monday morning, 11 a.m. for Clearing the Fog.
Speaking truth to expose the forces of greed.
Start the week with your eyes open.
The fog.
The forces of greed that spin news stories for the benefit of the 1%.
Each week we feature guests who are working to expose these truths and offer real solutions to the current crises we face.
Knowledge is power, and with knowledge you will be empowered to act to shift the power to the people.
Monday mornings at 11 a.m. on weactradio.com or 1480 a.m.
You're listening to We Act Radio, WPWC 1480 AM. Visit us online at weactradio.com.
Welcome back to Pivot Point. I'm your host, Maya Rockeymoore, and I'm very pleased that we are joined on the phone by Dr. William Spriggs. He serves as the chief economist at the AFL-CIO and is a professor in and the former chair of the Department of Economics at Howard University. And I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge that Dr. Spriggs served as the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary in the U.S. Department of Labor until recently. Welcome, Bill.
Thanks for having me.
And Isaiah Poole, who is the editor of ourfuture.org, and he directs Campaign for America's Futures online communications. Welcome, Isaiah.
Go Howard.
So,
you know.
Bisons we have bisons in this place. Okay, very good. Isaiah, you wrote an article this week that focused on Obama's 2014 budget. And what did you have to say about its focus on jobs?
Totally inadequate. President Obama has in his 2014 budget a proposal to spend something about $50 billion, I think that's the number roughly, on an infrastructure program and additional job training and so forth. It's part of something called the American Jobs Act that he's been pushing actually for a couple of years. What I wrote in that article is that when you look at what is happening in African American communities around the country, let's just take the neighborhood where this radio station is in Anacostia in Southeast Washington, where the unemployment rates are somewhere on the order of 20% or more.
Depression era levels.
And what I said was that when you look at these communities, Depression era conditions require Depression level responses. And we're just simply not seeing a depression level response from the Obama administration. Even with the stimulus, which was unprecedented, the 2009 stimulus program, which pumped about $890 billion into the economy in the form of spending plus tax breaks. That money was untargeted money for the most part. It went out to the entire country. It did not focus to a significant extent on communities that desperately needed economic rejuvenation. So today, African American unemployment still remains double that of white unemployment. We have not, in fact, that condition is worse than it was in the late 1990s.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Spriggs, you have been a long time expert in the area of African American employment. Do you see the 2014 budget in the same way, and what are the prospects for actually getting something done in the area of jobs?
Well, the conversation keeps being stymied, unfortunately, by the whole fight about the deficit, and the president hasn't successfully pivoted to a jobs agenda, and at each turn he seems to give in to the Republican urge to talk about the deficit instead of about jobs. The job situation is far more precarious than we talk about it in the public, generally speaking. The people who have been hit the hardest are those who are under 30. And it's because those who are under 30 didn't ever recover from the downturn in 2001. So what happened is, as we entered into this worst labor market of the post-war era, people who were 18 to 19, men in particular, and I'm using men because in the post-war era, women's labor force participation picked up in the 1960s, both black women and white women, in the late 1960s. And so some of their records are muddled with the fact that they were coming from a very low base in the 60s and 70s, and we're kind of sliding back to the 60s. But in the case of men, 18 to 19 years old, we have never, ever, even during the Great Depression, ever, I can't say ever enough, we have never, ever had a labor market work so poorly. So these are men who are recent high school graduates. It has never been the case in the entire history of the United States of America that we had 36% of them employed, ever. It's never been that low, ever.
And so
the problem is, before the recession hit, they were already at record low employment to population ratios. They were 52% behind in terms of, if you did the percentage of the workforce, that 52% more of them should have been employed before we got started, before we hit the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
And so they endured this gap. They reached their 20 when they got to their 20s. So they're still sort of in the middle. The group that turned 18 at the very bottom of the downturn. So now that they're in their 20s, they're about 12% behind. This is 700,000 people.
And by the way, you are talking about all races and ethnicity.
I'm talking about all races.
Yeah.
This is the severity of it. Yes, black people are hurt worse, but this is atom bomb proportion to young people.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, arguing if an atom bomb falls on Los Angeles, are black people going to die more than white people? I mean, this is a catastrophe. So they're 12% behind. 700,000 men more should be employed at this point in their careers, and the problem is that size, which is huge. It's a big American city. That size gap isn't going to close from just job training, because we don't do job training on that scale, and it's not going to close from small infrastructure projects.
Mm-hmm.
The size of the problem is so huge, and it hits that young generation so hard that not having this as the centerpiece of discussion, the deficit doesn't matter. They're not going to make it to the deficit. The deficit fight, as you pointed out to people many times in the hard work that you've been doing on this, that's 40 years away. They ain't going to make it 40 years.
Well, actually, it's the same question, though, because we're talking about, we often talk about here, and I'm actually going to come back to you, Isaiah, on the nature of the solutions in your opinion. But we often talk about, the fact that, because they are focused on debt reduction and because they erroneously throw in, quote unquote, entitlement reform, blaming Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid in some instances for the national debt. And these are all programs that young people will need specifically for the reasons that you just argued, Bill. That they have been behind and remain behind and shut out of a labor market, which means that their economic security, their health security is not guaranteed. And so when we're talking about Social Security and Medicare and reforming those programs, we need to really be talking about strengthening them for future generations, not cutting those benefits. Just to be clear. But Isaiah, so what should be the nature of the proposals? And by the way, we're a big fan of targeted universalism here. That universal programs can be targeted to meet the needs of specific highly vulnerable populations.
Absolutely right, and so do I. I think that even though Mr. Briggs said that small infrastructure programs aren't going to be enough, but they're part of the solution. Job training is not sufficient, but it's a little bit of the solution. And I think you do that through a combination of private sector initiatives as well as beefing up our community colleges and beefing up our 4-year colleges, in fact, so that college becomes more affordable for more young people. I mean, the thing that when I hear Bill Briggs talk about
Dr. Spriggs.
Dr. Spriggs, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
When I hear him talk about the work situation for young people under 30, I also think about the college debt that they're graduating with, that they will never be able to pay off in a reasonable amount of time.
For those who go to college.
For those who go to college. So there is a whole spectrum of things that we need to have in place. The point of my article was that there is a lot of work to be done in terms of public reinforcing our public transit, building out a new smart electrical grid, green energy retrofits for our public buildings, school construction and renovation. There's a whole host of things that we desperately need to do right now that we ought to be spending money on right now.
Dr. Spriggs, do you have other solutions?
Well, in the original America's Jobs Act, the president put all that stuff in, and he's retreated from some of those. So the current budget doesn't scale up those precise things.
Hold on. Bill, are you on speakerphone? Could you turn it off?
Oh, no, I'm not.
Okay.
So those were the specific things that were in the America's Jobs Act, and it's a shame that those are taken out of the discussion in the current budget. If the current budget was meant to be a wish list from the administration, it's unfortunate that those things got dropped, because the original America's Jobs Act did call for a very targeted approach of revitalizing schools, of going in and retrofitting communities, and to talk about high unemployment areas getting authority for direct job creation. So all of those things were there, and unfortunately when you look at the budget, we're left with small infrastructure and some job training, and not these more targeted things, and they need it to be even bigger. The gap, the GDP gap, is on the order of that's the gap between where we would be if we were at full employment. How much would the nation be producing, and how much we're producing now with this high level of unemployment? So that gap is 5.8%, which is about $800 billion. Another stimulus of that size would be necessary to get us back to full employment. So when he's offering 50 to 70 billion, and stimulus, that's still 10 times short of what it would take to get us back to full employment.
Which, by the way, we knew from the very beginning. In 2009, when some in the White House Council of Economic Advisors, none of whom who recommended a larger stimulus, said that we needed a larger stimulus, that the amount of the stimulus that they were pushing would not be sufficient. And sure enough, it was not sufficient. And those people who were making those recommendations are no longer at the White House. And yet we still continue to see this kind of, drib and drab when it comes to the issue of jobs. I've got to ask you all, I mean, is this real politic? Has the president been limited by the politics of Washington, where Republicans are refusing to actually negotiate on anything? Or has the president been hoisted by his own petard? Because I've got to ask this question, Isaiah. In I think it was February, March of 2009, the very first major event that the president held at the White House was a summit on fiscal responsibility, where he absolutely stepped right into the deficit hawk conversation about austerity. And where in the private session that I was at on Social Security, Larry Summers actually suggested that we were going to have to look at cuts to Social Security and Medicare because we needed to pay down long-term debt. So what is the strategy of this White House, and have they actually twisted themselves into a knot?
Well, I think what you just said, indicates that, the public of President Obama was frequently, particularly around the 2008 campaign, and perhaps early in 2009, the public President Obama was a person who fit many of the stereotypes of big spending liberal, particularly when he was pushing the what turned out, as you correctly said, a fundamentally inadequate stimulus program. And the reality is that for those of us who have seen him operate in the Senate, we knew that he was going to be prone to walk down this road of at least playing footsie with this austerity rhetoric. We did not know back in 2009 that what we would be confronted with in 2010 was a Republican-controlled House that would be so obstinate and so resistant to any positive proposals from the White House that we would end up in the deadlock that we are now. And given that deadlock, that President Obama has opted to do what I think is his natural tendency, which is to try to be the moderate, quote unquote, who will come in and placate this resistance rather than to forcefully marshal those of us who want to really be the champions of true economic bottoms-up revival and to try to marshal us into a force that would overcome that obstruction from the right.
Dr. Spriggs, haven't we seen this placation, if you will, I don't even know if that's a word, haven't we seen the 2014 budget, to the extent that it has this chain CPI proposal in it, can be seen as placating the deficit austerity crowd? Do you think that the administration has placed itself into a lockbox on jobs by playing on this austerity playing field?
Oh, I think they have, because there's no way for them to pivot the size of the stimulus that's necessary at this point. And the reason for the urgency has to deal with these young people. At this stage, when you're 25, your plane is on the runway. It's already started what's supposed to be the takeoff, and they're still taxiing. And so it's sort of like if you take off from National Airport, you have to pick up speed, because if you don't, you end up in the Potomac.
You're in the water.
And that's where we're headed with this generation. And so it can't be that we'll let this happen and, maybe 10 years from now we'll be at full employment. 10 years from now, they will be where prime earning age is supposed to be. And as you mentioned with Social Security, it means this generation, those who are under 30, will be more dependent on Social Security than their parents ever would have been.
Mm-hmm.
And their needs are going to be vast. Some of them don't even qualify for Social Security right now. They in the past, because most young people had some job experience by the time they were 20, they would have accumulated the 10 quarters
Mm-hmm.
to get them disability
Right.
and survivor's benefits. This generation will have a sizable chunk of people who don't have that.
A quick question.
And so yeah, I think the president has worked himself into a box, because now if he came before the American people, having talked the way he's been talking so far, and said, "Look, I need $800 billion in order to get young people jobs," it would be coming from nowhere.
It seemingly to the public.
Yes.
But, I mean, if he wanted to put his political capital there and make the case, he could. But it seems to be beyond their wherewithal there in the White House. A quick question. Is there any notion that, by the way, our show is carried in Iowa now. We've been syndicated in Iowa. And so is there a rural deficit when it comes to jobs that we should be aware of? And by the way, how does immigration play into the wherewithal, the labor market for younger people?
Well, if we can make those who are already here legal, that frees up a large part of the economy to function the way that it should. It's been a bad weight on the economy that we have all these people who can't fully function in the economy. There's certain things they can't buy because they can't get banked, they can't get credit. They're limited in buying homes, limited in buying cars. They face so many limits, and the biggest limit they face are the full enjoyment of their rights as American workers.
That's right.
So that's going to make things a lot better for everyone if they are fully functioning. But it also means that we need to have the urgency of creating jobs, because not only will they become American citizens, but it means that they can reunite family members. And so we need to pay attention to job creation so that we can absorb everyone that's here. And those who are under 30 and those that we're about to make legal will have full access to job opportunities. That's only going to make the economy grow. We all end up better in the end if we force the economy to grow. And if rich people have to pay taxes, then rich people have to pay taxes.
Do rich people have to pay taxes, Isaiah?
Rich people do have to pay taxes.
How do we make them pay taxes?
Well,
given the politics that we've got.
Well, that was the rub, given the politics that we have. But I think, the American public is very wise on this issue. Overwhelming majorities, and we've been looking at polls for like a couple of years on this issue, and there have been actually polls that have gone back even further than that. And when you ask them about how they want taxes reform, they want a more progressive tax system where corporations and wealthy people pay a little bit more, and that money is then poured back into the basic resources that we need to keep this economy functioning. And I think the thing that really makes people irate is when they know that our largest corporations, the ones that are making millions and billions of dollars in quarterly profits, are paying tax rates of 3, 4, 5% on those profits.
If they're paying taxes at all.
If they're paying, and some like ExxonMobil are getting rebates,
which is amazing and criminal.
I would call it criminal. Absolutely right. But the notion that we have that rich people have ways of sheltering their taxes in tax havens is abhorrent to the American public. And I think if you put together, there is a lot of political capital to be used if President Obama chose to use it to say that these kinds of tax reforms that clears out the tax havens, clears out the loopholes, says to corporations, if you're going to be an American corporation, you're going to pay American taxes.
But Bill, some people are arguing that the president actually offered the chain CPI and other reductions in order to bring Republicans to the table so that they could do a deal on taxes. Do you actually believe that argument?
Well, no, that is what the White House believes, and it believes that by appearing reasonable, that people would believe that the Republicans were at fault in not being able to reach a conclusion. The problem is that, and you've pointed this out on Social Security, the real gap in Social Security is the cap that keeps those with higher incomes from paying their fair share into Social Security.
Right.
That's really what causes any funding problem there is in Social Security. And now that we have the data that clearly shows higher income people live longer, any justification for the cap is now removed, because the justification before was, if everybody's going to live the same amount of time and we're not going to make benefits any higher for people with certain incomes, then why should they ever pay more in Social Security tax? Well, now it's evident. They should pay more because, in the end, this is a limitless benefit, and you're the ones who get the limitless part of it.
That's right.
So your cap should be much higher if there is a cap at all, because we are saying until you die, which may for people with high incomes be when they're 120. So there shouldn't be a cap on the Social Security tax. So by using the chain CPI as an offer, he's diverting from the real problem, if there is a problem, in Social Security finance, and diverting us from the broader conversation about what is it that Americans really need. We're building the whole economic discussion on what can rich people agree to pay,
Right.
as opposed to what does America need. And Mr. Poole was making this point very clearly. With a bigger group of young people and more education being needed in the current society, we clearly have to pick up our investment in college education.
That's right.
And the president, fortunately, understands that they don't get to college if we don't do the pre-K part. So he has that part in the budget. But he substituted bigger support for college that is really necessary so they can have quality education, not just what these states can afford, because states have been cutting back on their support of college education. So as much money as he's increased the Pell Grant, the actual expenditure per student in our colleges is going down. We're just putting more burden on the students in terms of tuition and loans, but the value of what they're getting, the quality of what they're getting, how much we're investing in them, that's been going down.
The bottom line is that if we really cared about the debt that young people are going to face in the future, instead of fixating on the size of the federal budget right now, we would be fixated on the size of the job market, on the level of college debt, on all of these other issues that that are real overhangs, that are really limiting the futures of our young people in the country.
That's right. I want to shift gears just a little bit. We talk here a lot about retirement security, and everybody knows that housing wealth is a major form of security for people in retirement. The fact that they get equity out of their homes has fueled retirement security for certain populations. Yeah, what do we know about the housing crisis that is ongoing? That foreclosures are still a part of our present, not just a part of our past. That banks have literally gotten off scot-free and are calling the shots still. Any comment?
I'm still working with a friend of mine who was actually foreclosed on by Bank of America and was about to lose his house. And we marshaled a group of young people to actually hold demonstrations at Bank of America's around the city to call attention to his situation. And I can say that we managed to reverse the foreclosure. That was due to not only our public pressure, but because of the national public pressure that we've exerted on Bank of America, Wells Fargo, and all these other institutions. What is the reality is that we still have a regulatory structure that allows these banks to be, that's allowed these banks to be too big, to be too concentrated, and allows them to engage in risky behaviors that threaten the future of the economy,
The global economy, I would
the
add.
future of the global economy,
Right.
and where they're still in the position where they can privatize the benefits and socialize the risks.
Yeah.
And that is what we have to fundamentally change.
Dr. Spriggs, I think most Americans think, okay, well, there's been an AG settlement. There's been this, there's been that. The Obama administration has created a couple of programs. What needs to happen? Because we know that people are hemorrhaging and that the impact of these foreclosures, not only the impact of the foreclosures, but also what may be the inability of future generations to access affordable mortgages easily is compromised. What needs to happen moving forward?
We have to start the whole conversation about housing and access to home ownership again. And unfortunately, we have been so hung up on blaming people who got foreclosed on. Too much of the debate has been about irresponsible loans being taken out, and not enough on the banks themselves. And despite settlements from the Attorney General's office that makes clear all of the illegal operations that were taking place, the targeted discrimination that was taking place, this conversation still goes around as if the market was doing the right thing. So we really have to get back to what is going to be our national policy going forward. Mm-hmm. Most of these young people today are putting off family formation because they don't have jobs.
Right.
And when they finally do get to that conversation, given the weakness of their employment records, they're not going to have the incomes for 20% down payments. Mm-hmm. They're not going to have relationships with banks to get them the credit record for conventional loans. Right. And so we don't have a way forward for folks under 30. There's no way, given how we've structured things, for them to have a path unless we have a serious national discussion. Okay, what are we going to do? And you know, it is at a discussion where America could have it because it is affecting everyone. Everyone. It's not just a few people here or there. It's not racialized. It's not geographic. It is really a general conversation about our failure to do anything for people under 30 and the world they're about to enter and the future they're about to have. And in that conversation, the president's ability to pull America together, that's what he needs to be using his talents and his political capital for. So we can have that unifying discussion and be honest about what is the world that these young people are facing and how can we build a government that's going to be responsive to them and puts them first and says, we need a government, and whatever that budget is, that's going to be the budget. Then we figure out who pays for it. But we're starting the backwards way. We're starting with, okay, rich people can't afford this, so we're going to do the size government that pleases rich people. We're not saying what does the American people need.
Right.
We're not saying what do we need for our future. This is the budget that will get us there.
All right.
I think we actually are going to need to develop some new voices. President Obama, you're right, should be having that conversation. I am not depending on President Obama to have that lead that conversation. I think we absolutely need to develop new leaders to lead that conversation. Encourage more voices to go forward and to talk about what the role of our government should be. What should we do to address the continuing inequalities in this country around race and class? I think, Obama was a fresh voice on that several years ago, but I think his capacity to pivot and lead that kind of conversation has now been compromised. So we need someone else to step up to the plate.
Compromised and diminished. Thank you, Isaiah Poole, editor of ourfuture.org and director of the Campaign for America's Future online communications operation. Dr. William Spriggs, chief economist at the AFL-CIO. Thanks to both of you for your comments today and your insight. I hope I can have both of you on in the future.
Thanks
for having us.
Thank you. And you have, thanks to my listening audience, for joining me for yet another edition of Pivot Point with Maya Rockeymoore. I want to thank our sponsors, the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare, and also our producer, Peter James Callahan, here in We Act Studio. Join us every Sunday at 3 p.m. Eastern Time on weactradio.com or 1480 a.m. if you're in Washington, D.C. Until next time, America.